The razor had been purchased 3 days earlier from a shop on Main Street in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a straight razor, the kind that barbers used, with a bone handle and a blade that folded into itself like a secret waiting to be told. The girl who bought it was 19 years old. She told the shopkeeper she needed it for personal grooming. He did not ask further questions because it was not his business, and because the girl, though young, carried herself with a certainty that discouraged curiosity. She paid. She left. She put the razor in her pocket, and she carried it with her for 3 days, waiting for the moment she had been planning for months, the moment when she would see the face of the person she loved more than anyone in the world and draw the blade across her throat. Her name was Alice Mitchell. She had been born on the 26th of November, 1872, in Memphis, Tennessee, to George and Isabella Mitchell, a prosperous and well-known family in the city's upper social circles. George Mitchell was a successful businessman. Isabella was a woman of standing in Memphis society, though her life had been marked by periods of severe illness that the family described publicly as melancholia, and that the medical records of the time documented in terms that would later carry a weight far heavier than anyone in the Mitchell household could have anticipated. Alice was the youngest of 4 surviving children out of 7 born to Isabella. She had 2 older brothers, Robert and Frank, and 2 older sisters, Mattie and Addie. She was closest to Frank. From childhood, the 2 of them had been inseparable in the way that siblings are inseparable when they share a temperament that the rest of the family does not fully understand. They played marbles together. They practiced shooting with a rifle. They climbed fences and rode horses and moved through the world with a physicality that the conventions of 1880s Memphis considered appropriate for a boy and bewildering in a girl. Alice was not interested in dolls. She was not interested in the quiet, indoor occupations that her sisters preferred. She was interested in the swing in the yard and the horse in the stable, and the feeling of moving fast through open space, and she pursued these interests with a focus that her family regarded as eccentric but harmless. She enrolled at the Higbee School for Girls in Memphis, a private institution for the daughters of the city's prominent white families, where young women were taught music, languages, deportment, and the particular skills required to navigate the social expectations of the American South in the final decade of the 19th century. It was there, in the corridors and classrooms of the Higbee School, that Alice met a girl named Frida Ward, and everything that followed, every headline and every courtroom and every asylum corridor and every unmarked grave, began with that meeting. Frida Ward had been born on the 5th of March, 1874, in Memphis, to Thomas and Cornelia Ward. She was 17 at the time of her death. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, pretty and quiet and possessed of the kind of gentle compliance that the world of 1890s Memphis rewarded in young women, and that concealed, as it so often does, a capacity for feeling that the surface gave no indication of. She and Alice became close at the Higbee School, in the way that girls at single-sex institutions in the 19th century often became close, with an intensity of affection that their teachers and classmates regarded as ordinary and even admirable. It was called chumming. It was considered a healthy expression of feminine friendship. Girls held hands. Girls wrote letters to each other filled with declarations of love. Girls slept in the same bed during overnight visits. None of this attracted comment or concern, because none of it was understood to be anything other than what it appeared to be, which was the innocent, ardent devotion of young women who had not yet transferred their affections to the young men who would, in due course, arrive to claim them. Alice and Freda did not transfer their affections. They deepened them. The friendship became something that neither girl had a word for, because the word did not yet exist in common American usage, and the feelings that the word would have described were understood by the world around them not as love but as illness, not as devotion but as aberration. not as something to be honored, but as something to be treated, confined, and if necessary, destroyed. When the Ward family moved from Memphis to the small town of Gold Dust, Tennessee, a short steamboat ride up the Mississippi River, the separation was devastating for both girls. They wrote to each other constantly. The letters, which would later be read aloud in a courtroom packed with spectators and reported in newspapers across the country, contained declarations of love so direct and so unguarded that they left no room for the kind of reinterpretation that the society of their time would desperately attempt to impose upon them. Alice proposed to Frida. She gave her a ring. The inscription inside read, "From A to F." They planned to elope to St. Louis, Missouri, where Alice would cut her hair, dress in men's clothing, assume the name Alvin J. Ward, and find work to support them both. They would live as husband and wife. The plan was detailed. The plan was earnest. The plan was the product of two young hearts that had found in each other something the world had told them did not exist and had decided, with the particular courage of people who have nothing to lose except the person they cannot bear to lose, that the world was wrong. In August of 1891, the plan was discovered. Frida's older married sister, Ada Volkmar, who lived in Gold Dust and in whose home Frida was staying, caught Frida one night with her suitcase packed, preparing to leave for Memphis. Ada demanded an explanation. Frida, unable to lie convincingly and unwilling to betray Alice entirely, told her sister enough. Ada found the letters, she found the ring. She read the plans, and she responded with the full force of a woman who understood exactly what the discovery meant for her family's reputation in a community where reputation was the only currency that could not be earned back once it was spent. Ada forbade all further contact between Frida and Alice. She forbade all correspondence. She forbade Frida's younger sister Jo from continuing her friendship with Alice's close friend, Lily Johnson, on the grounds that Lily was wild and a bad influence. The severance was total. The door between Alice and Frida was closed and locked and bolted, and the key was held by a family that believed it was protecting its youngest member from something dangerous and unnatural. Frida complied. She stopped writing. She stopped asking about Alice. She resumed the life that her family expected of her, attending social gatherings, receiving the attention of young men, entertaining the possibility of marriage to someone appropriate. She did these things because she was 17 and because the pressure being applied to her from every direction was more than she could resist, and because the alternative, which was to defy her family and run to Alice and face the consequences of a love that her world had decided was a form of madness, required a kind of strength that Frida, for all her quiet courage, did not possess. Alice did not comply. Alice could not comply. The separation drove her into a depression so severe that her family became alarmed. She stopped eating. She lost weight. She withdrew from the activities and the friendships that had previously sustained her. She spent hours sitting in silence, staring at nothing, and when she spoke it was only to ask, in the flat, affectless voice of a person who has been hollowed out by grief, whether anyone had heard from Frida, whether anyone knew how Frida was, whether anyone could tell her if Frida was well. No one could tell her. No one would tell her. The wall between them held. In January of 1892, Frida came to Memphis. She was visiting a family friend named Mrs. Kimbrough, who lived on Hernando Street, and she was accompanied by her sister Jo and a friend named Christina Purnell. The visit was supposed to be brief. A few days of shopping and socializing, and then a steamboat ride back to Gold Dust aboard the Aura Lee. Alice learned that Frida was in Memphis. The exact manner in which she obtained this information is not recorded, but in a city the size of Memphis in 1892, among families that moved in the same social circles and attended the same churches and shopped at the same stores, the arrival of a girl from Gold Dust at a house on Hernando Street was not the kind of information that remained secret for long. Alice knew. And once she knew, she began to watch. She drove her buggy back and forth past the Kimbrough house on Hernando Street, hoping to catch a glimpse of Frida through a window or on the porch. She enlisted Lily Johnson, her closest friend, to help her. Together, they spent days tracking Frida's movements through the city, following her at a distance, watching her come and go, and Alice carried the razor in her pocket through all of it, the blade folded into the handle warm against her thigh, and she waited. On the morning of the 25th of January, 1892, Alice picked up Lily Johnson and Lily's 6-year-old nephew in her buggy. They drove around Memphis throughout the morning, passing the Kimbrough house multiple times. In the early afternoon, they spotted Frida, Joe Ward, and Christina Purnell leaving the house on foot, walking toward the riverfront. The 3 young women were heading to the steamboat landing to board the Aura Lee for the return trip to Gold Dust. This was the moment. Alice knew it. She had known it for days. Perhaps she had known it for months. She brought the buggy to the top of the bluff above the Mississippi River. The cobblestone landing stretched below, busy with the commerce of a river city, men loading cotton bales, passengers waiting for departures, the great brown water of the Mississippi moving past with the indifferent force of something that has been moving for longer than anyone can remember and will continue moving long after everyone presently watching it is gone. Alice got down from the buggy. Lily and the boy remained. Alice walked down the bluff toward the 3 young women. She passed them on the sidewalk. Then she turned. She came up behind Frida. She reached around Frida's body from behind, and with the razor she had purchased 3 days earlier, she slashed Frida across the throat. The cut was deep. The cut was deliberate. Frida staggered. Joe Ward, Frida's sister, turned and saw what was happening and attacked Alice with an umbrella, striking her repeatedly. Alice, in the chaos, slashed Joe across the collarbone, cutting through fabric and skin. Then she turned back to Frida, who was bleeding and disoriented and stumbling on the cobblestones, and she cut her throat a second time, deeper, with a motion that witnesses described as swift and certain, the motion of a person who knew exactly what she was doing and had imagined doing it so many times that the execution of the act contained none of the hesitation that the act itself should have demanded. Frida collapsed on the cobblestones near the railroad tracks that ran along the riverfront. Bystanders rushed to her. Someone pressed a cloth to her throat. Someone sent for a doctor. Alice turned and walked back up the bluff to the buggy where Lily Johnson was waiting. She climbed in. She looked at Lily. The words that passed between them in that moment, as reconstructed from Lily's testimony at trial, were these. "I have killed Frida," Alice said. "And now, I want to kill myself." Lily said nothing. She took the reins. She drove the buggy away from the riverfront, away from the crowd that was gathering around the bleeding girl on the cobblestones, away from the screams of Joe Ward and Christina Purnell, and toward the Mitchell family home at 215 Union Street, where Alice would tell her mother what she had done, and her mother would call the police, and the story of Alice Mitchell and Frida Ward would leave the private world of letters and rings and whispered plans and enter the public world of courtrooms and newspapers and medical testimony, where it would be dissected and debated and pathologized and condemned and remembered for the next 133 years. Frida Ward died on the cobblestones. She was 17 years old. The doctor who reached her could not stop the bleeding. The razor had severed the blood vessels on the left side of her throat with a precision that the medical examiner would later describe as surgical. She bled out on the landing above the Mississippi River, surrounded by strangers, within sight of the steamboat that was supposed to carry her home. Alice was arrested at the Mitchell family home later that afternoon. She did not resist. She did not deny what she had done. She was taken to the Shelby County Jail and placed in a special section reserved for privileged white inmates, a detail that said as much about Memphis in 1892 as anything that happened in the courtroom that followed. The newspapers erupted. The Memphis Commercial, the Memphis Appeal Avalanche, the Evening Scimitar, and the Public Ledger competed with each other for the most detailed and the most sensational coverage of a crime that contained everything the American press of the 1890s needed to sell papers for months. A respectable young woman from a prominent family, a razor, a murder on the riverfront in broad daylight, and the element that no editor could resist and no reader could look away from, the fact that the killer and the victim were both women, that they had been in love, that they had planned to marry, and that the love letters read aloud in the courtroom were so passionate and so explicit in their devotion that the newspapers alternated between printing them in full and declaring them unfit for publication. The trial, technically a lunacy inquisition rather than a criminal trial, began in July of 1892 at the Shelby County Courthouse in Memphis. Alice's attorneys, led by Colonel George Gant, entered a plea of present insanity, arguing that Alice had been insane before the murder, was insane at the time of the murder, and remained insane, and that her mental state made it impossible for her to stand trial for the crime she had openly admitted to committing. The courtroom was packed. Thousands of people attempted to gain entry. Spectators filled every seat, stood along the walls, and crowded the hallways outside the doors. The case had drawn national attention, and reporters from cities across the United States had traveled to Memphis to cover it. The defense called 5 physicians to testify. Their testimony introduced the American public to a vocabulary it had not previously encountered in a courtroom: erotomania, paranoia, monomania, sexual inversion. The doctors argued that Alice's feelings for Frida were not love but disease, not devotion but delusion, and that the murder was the inevitable eruption of an illness that had been growing inside her since childhood, fed by a hereditary predisposition to insanity that could be traced through her mother Isabella's history of institutionalization. Alice herself testified. She was calm, she was direct, she did not cry. She told the court that she had loved Frida Ward, that she had intended to marry her, that she had planned to live with her as husband and wife, and that when the possibility of this future was taken from her, she had decided that if she could not have Frida, no one could. The words she spoke, as recorded in the trial transcript and published in newspapers across the country, were these: "I wanted to cut her because I knew I could not have her, and I did not want anyone else to have her." The courtroom absorbed the statement in silence. The spectators stared, the reporters wrote, and the doctors, who had spent days constructing an elaborate framework of medical terminology to explain what had happened on the riverfront, found themselves confronted with an explanation that was far simpler and far more devastating than anything their science could offer. Alice had loved Frida. Frida had been taken from her, and Alice had responded with the only power she had left, which was the power to ensure that the loss was total and permanent and shared. The trial lasted 6 days. Love letters were read aloud. The engagement ring was produced as evidence. The inscription, from A to F, was noted for the record. Lily Johnson testified about the elopement plans, the buggy rides past the Kimbrough house, the morning of the murder, and Alice's words afterward. Alice's father and brother testified on her behalf, describing her withdrawal, her depression, her refusal to eat. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. They found Alice Mitchell presently insane. She was committed to the Western Hospital for the Insane in Bolivar, Tennessee, on the 1st of August, 1892. She was 19 years old. She would never leave. The asylum in Bolivar was a large, imposing institution set on a hill above the town, a place where the state of Tennessee confined those it deemed too dangerous or too broken or too incomprehensible to remain among the general population. Alice was assigned a room, she was given a routine, she was observed, and the world outside, which had consumed her story with the particular hunger that the press reserves for crimes it does not understand, moved on to other stories and other scandals and other trials, and Alice Mitchell was left to the silence of an institution that was designed to contain the people that society had decided it could not explain. She lived there for 6 years. The officials at the asylum could at any time have declared Alice competent to stand trial. They never did. Whether this was because they genuinely believed she remained insane, or because the state of Tennessee preferred to keep her confined without the complications of a murder trial, or because no one in a position of authority wanted to reopen a case that had already caused more public discomfort than anyone wished to revisit, the records do not say. Alice died on the 31st of March, 1898. She was 25 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as tuberculosis, which was widespread in such institutions and which claimed inmates with the regularity of a clock that no one could stop. But decades later, in an interview published in a Memphis newspaper during the 1930s, one of Alice's attorneys revealed a different account. He said that Alice had killed herself by jumping into the water tower at the asylum. He said it matter-of-factly, as though the information had been common knowledge among those close to the case and had simply never been made public, because making it public would have required acknowledging that the institution charged with keeping Alice Mitchell alive had failed, and that the girl who had been deemed too insane to stand trial had been sane enough to find a way out of the place that was holding her. She was buried in the Mitchell family plot at Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis. Her grave was marked. Her name was carved into the stone. The dates were recorded. The family mourned privately, and the city of Memphis, which had followed the case with such intensity that the courthouse could not hold the crowds, allowed the name Alice Mitchell to settle into the sediment of local memory, spoken less and less with each passing decade, until it became the kind of story that older residents told younger ones only when prompted, and only in lowered voices, and only with the caveat that such things were different then, that the world had changed, that what happened on the riverfront in 1892 could not happen now. Frida Ward was buried at Elmwood Cemetery as well, but her grave was not marked. For 125 years, the girl whose throat was cut on the cobblestones above the Mississippi River lay in the Grace Episcopal Church plot at Elmwood without a stone, without an inscription, without anything to indicate that a 17-year-old girl was buried there, except a single tree that grew above the spot where she had been placed in the ground in January of 1892. In December of 2017, 125 years after Frida's death, two local advocates named Audrey May and Vincent Astor organized a ceremony at Elmwood Cemetery. They had raised the money for a gravestone. They had contacted the cemetery. They had invited members of the community, and on a warm, sunny December afternoon, a small group gathered around Frida Ward's grave and watched as a stone was placed on the ground that bore her name, her dates, and the acknowledgement that she had existed, that she had been loved, that she had been killed, and that for 125 years the world had not thought it necessary to mark the place where she lay. Audrey May spoke. "In the 125th year after Frida's death," she said, "the tours will now be complete." The group then walked across the cemetery to the Mitchell family plot. Alice's grave was there, as it had always been, marked, named, remembered. The killer's grave had carried a stone for 125 years. The victim's had not. And the distance between the two, measured not in feet, but in the priorities of a world that remembers violence more readily than it remembers the people violence was done to, was the final detail in a story that had never been about the razor at all. It had been about love. The kind of love that the world of 1892 had no word for and no room for and no mercy for. The kind of love that was diagnosed as disease and treated as insanity and punished with confinement and silence and an unmarked grave. The kind of love that Alice Mitchell carried inside her like a fire she could not extinguish and could not survive, and that Frida Ward received with a tenderness she was forbidden to return, and that both of them lost on a January afternoon on the cobblestones above the Mississippi River, when a razor opened a throat, and the world decided that the most important question was not why two girls had loved each other, but what was wrong with them for doing so. Alice is at Elmwood. Frida is at Elmwood. They are in the same cemetery, separated by a few hundred yards of grass and stone, and the particular silence that settles over places where people are buried, and the stories they carried are buried with them. Alice's grave has always had a name on it. Frida's, as of 2017, finally does too. The river still moves past Memphis. The cobblestones on the landing have been replaced. The Higbee School closed long ago. The courtroom where the trial was held has been renovated and repurposed. The asylum in Bolivar still stands, though it serves a different function now. And the word that Alice and Frida did not have, the word that the doctors at the trial replaced with erotomania and sexual inversion and monomania, the word that the newspapers wrapped in quotation marks and printed in italics as though it were a foreign term that decent people should not be expected to pronounce, exists now. It has existed for decades. It is spoken openly in most of the world. It is no longer a diagnosis. It is no longer a crime. It is no longer grounds for confinement in an asylum on a hill in Tennessee. But it was. In 1892, in Memphis, it was all of those things, and a 17-year-old girl bled to death on the riverfront because of it, and a 19-year-old girl was locked in an asylum until she found a way to stop living, and neither of them ever got to find out what the world would look like when it finally learned to say the word without flinching. This is the story I was not sure I should tell, not because it is not important, because it is the most important kind of story there is, the kind where the crime and the punishment and the grief and the silence all point in the same direction, toward a world that was not ready for what it was seeing and chose to destroy it rather than understand it. Alice killed Frida, that is a fact. But the question this case leaves behind is not about the murder. It is about everything that came before it. What happens to love when every door is closed against it? What happens to a person when the thing they feel most deeply is the thing the world punishes most severely? And what does it say about us, about all of us, that for 125 years, the girl who held the razor had a gravestone, and the girl whose throat was cut did not? Tell me in the comments. And if Frida Ward's name deserves to be spoken as loudly as the name of the person who took her life, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because there are more names waiting in the silence, and I intend to speak every one of them. I will see you in the next one.